Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of our global webinar series on the topic, The New Energy Mix and the Sustainable Blue Economy, Exploring Challenges and Opportunities. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are across the various time zones. I see that we're a little over 120 people, so it's a great pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Sadhika Shashi Prabhu, and I work with the United Nations Environment Programme in the Disasters and Conflicts branch based in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm an analyst under the partnership between UNEP and the government of Norway, which works to promote and strengthen national institutional capacities to reduce environmental pollution risks, especially in the energy sector. Previously, with a focus on oil and gas, our work now increasingly looks at the environmental implications of renewable energy, particularly offshore energy in the marine environment. Our work involves delivering technical assistance and training to countries, as well as undertaking global outreach activities that address social, environmental, and governance safeguards in the energy sector. This annual global webinar series is our attempt to spread awareness and encourage multi-stakeholder dialogues about the latest developments in the energy sector. This year, we chose to focus on sustainable ocean governance and energy considerations, given the increased policy attention that the blue economy has received in recent times. Oceans form a life-giving nexus. They help regulate the climate, provide food, facilitate trade, and are integral to planetary health and human well-being. As oceans get busier, so do the threats like rising temperature, pollution risks, and biodiversity loss multiply. So this webinar encourages a global dialogue on navigating the challenges and opportunities of coexistence between sectors in the marine space. Before we start, I just wanted to go over some logistics. Please remember this is a recorded webinar and it will be available and uploaded on our YouTube channel. We also really encourage audience participation and ask you to send all your questions and queries into the chat box. We will try to answer and address as many of them during the question and answer session. Feel free to type in. Unfortunately, given time constraints, we are not able to give you the floor. If you stay with us till the end of this webinar, you will receive a certificate of participation, which you will receive once you fill out the webinar evaluation form. For your reference, the PowerPoints used today, as well as the biographies of our speakers, are uploaded in the handout section. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ms. Salela Okoth, our session moderator. She's the Senior Principal of Environmental Assessment at the National Environment Management Authority, Kenya. She's in charge of the Petroleum Desk and oversees environmental compliance of upstream and midstream facilities in Kenya. She was pivotal in the drafting of the Petroleum Act 2019, in which she ensured that environmental requirements and considerations were provided for. Salela holds a Master of Science in Urban Environmental Planning and Management, is currently pursuing a PhD in Environmental Policy at the University of Nairobi, with her research focusing on environmental policy making in developing countries. We're so happy to have you on board. Over to you, Salela.
Very much, Sadhika. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us around the world. It is my pleasure to be moderating this webinar today. Today's webinar will be discussing the offshore energy sector in the context of what is increasingly being referred to as the blue economy, recognizing that our coastal waters and oceans are important source and driver of our local and national economies. The health and the status of our waters offshore matter. In this regard, the offshore energy sector plays a critical role in co-managing our blue economy in a sustainable manner. This webinar will look at energy trends and discuss environmental considerations in offshore energy development, which includes both renewables, in particular offshore wind energy, and offshore oil and gas. We will look at how industry actors and energy companies apply environmental measures to avoid and reduce potential environmental impacts, including reducing GHG emissions and pollution risks from the sector. The webinar also hopes to shed light on how government and private actors can mobilize climate commitments and manage a sustainable blue economy, and address challenges faced in countries such as policy coherence across sectors, institutional coordination, and capacity challenges. As a national environmental regulator in my home country of Kenya, with an extensive coastline, I am particularly looking forward to our discussions today. With that, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, who will be giving us opening remarks for this particular webinar 2 series. I wish to introduce Jessica Smith, who leads the nature team at the UNEP Finance Initiative, promoting leadership on nature and nature-based solutions from the banking, insurance, and investment industries. She has led in setting up major initiatives such as the Task Force on Nature-Based Financial Disclosures and on private sector engagement into the Convention on, for Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties that led to the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So first of all, I will just briefly mention that UNEP-FI is an interface between the ideals and the decisions that are taken at the United Nations and the reality of the mainstream finance sector. So we work with groupings of banks, insurers, and with those investors who want to lead on environmental and social sustainability topics. And ocean finance is a very interesting theme because our ocean ecosystem is enormous. It's effectively 70% of the surface of our planet. And we can go on to the next slide. Around 2.5 trillion is derived from ocean-related goods and services every year, but not all of this is sustainable blue economy. This is blue economy, but not necessarily sustainable blue economy. So we partnered with WWF, the World Resources Institute, the European Investment Bank, and European Commission to develop a set of principles for sustainable blue economy finance. And these principles are listed here on the right hand of the screen, but to go through them in a little bit more detail, these are really around protecting, conserving, restoring the ecosystem services that come from marine and protected areas, to go beyond compliance with international law, domestic law, other norms and principles to try to reach positive impact in nature finance, to be inclusive, to support the diversification of marine and coastal economies, including small and medium-sized enterprises, for stewards like Indigenous peoples and local communities, to be transparent in what types of financing are being provided and the products that are available, as well as taking the precautionary principle. So the organizations that have signed the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles have agreed to actually apply these across their entire portfolio. So this is not only, one-off products with a blue label, but they're agreeing to look at their entire portfolio and move towards targets for blue economy that are net zero, nature positive, that address pollution, that address inclusion in a very harmonized way. So within this, we have 87 members who manage collectively 11 trillion in total assets. And we have a very dynamic community of practice, including our links within the UNEP very science-based programs, and then groups of banks, insurers, investors, and key experts in this space. So we can go on to the next slide. So from principles to guidance, the principles are aspirational and broad, but we actually go into quite a lot of detail to make this very tangible and pragmatic. And from a financial perspective, we have effectively a traffic light system. Certain activities are harmful, are classed as harmful, or where there is not enough information in hand to make a qualified decision on it. So those are either too harmful or too risky, so the guidance recommends not financing those activities. Challenge is where there's opportunities to engage with the client to look for potentially transition paths or alternate activities. And then seek out is those, really positive, net zero, nature positive, circular economy, regenerative opportunities, where it's a great, great opportunity and encouraged to be financed. So if we can go to the next slide, we have very detailed guidance for sectors which include renewable energy and also coastal infrastructure and resilience. So we do cover many of the topics, the ocean themes that are of interest to this series. I also want to mention we've recently published blue bond guidelines. So you may be aware that the bond market for ocean related activities has, very dramatically accelerated. And the blue bond guidance was developed with the International Capital Markets Association, IFC, and other partners, including Global Compact and the Asian Development Bank, to really bring some consistency. And we're really proud that all of these partners came together to apply the, as I said, very aspirational sustainable blue economy principles very rigorously within the blue bond guidelines. So I welcome you to take a look at all the resources that we have. As I mentioned, this is really from a financial perspective, and we do see over the future sustainability increasingly aligning with sustainable profits and better risk management. So that's what I'd like to end on, and I will hand back to Salela, and thank you very much for having me in this introduction.
Thank you very much. Sorry, 1 second. Thank you very much, Jessica, for that insightful presentation, which gives us some good heads up on how this conversation should go. And I think we truly appreciate the documents you've also shared for this particular meeting. That said, I wish to invite our first panelist, the speaker, Simon Benmaraz, who is the team leader for technology and infrastructure at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. His work focuses on the acceleration and integration of renewable technologies and offshore wind energy infrastructure to support international climate goals. He leads the Global Offshore Wind Alliance at IRENA, coordinating with member states and private sector partners to enhance the development and efficiency of the offshore wind sector. Feel welcome, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serela, and a very good morning or afternoon to everyone here. As Serela mentioned, I'm part of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. We are an intergovernmental organization with 168 members, headquarters in the United Arab Emirates, and our mandate is to promote the use and support the deployment of renewable energies across the world. I wanted to start with, let's say, the realization that achieving the critical goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 is today at stake. The target has been a central pillar of the Paris Agreement and is widely recognized as the threshold beyond which the consequences of climate change could become increasingly severe. In that perspective, renewable energy, the renewable energy sector plays a pivotal role in this endeavor, driven by the progress in technologies, the emergence of conducive policies, and global cooperation to support and implement more renewables. A stark reality emerged from the world as we collectively veers significantly off course. Despite international commitment and concerted efforts, this ambitious goal of keeping the warming below 1.5 appear increasingly elusive. The urgency of addressing climate change remains undeniable and necessitates intensified action, innovative solutions, and enhanced cooperation to bridge the gap between the current trajectory and the 1.5 degree target. A promising outlook developed by IRENA emerged, And we try to show that renewables hold the potential to decarbonize a substantial 90% of the power sector by the year 2050. This is called the World Energy Transition Outlook. And this transformation is anticipated to be underpinned by offshore energy, among others, which is poised to play a pivotal role in the global energy transition. This technology is expected to emerge as one of the dominant sources of power generation, collectively both onshore and offshore, supplying a substantial 25% of the total power needs by 2050. For offshore wind, the growth trajectory is remarkable, with installed capacity projected to surge to 34 from around 34 gigawatt in the recent years to an impressive 494 gigawatt by 2030. This trend is set to accelerate further as offshore wind capacity is expected to soar to an astounding 2,465 gigawatt by 2050. In the landscape of global wind energy installation, several markets demonstrate significant strength and growth, notably China, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Poland have emerged as prominent players in the offshore wind sector. These nations are witnessing substantial investment and development in offshore wind projects, contributing to the expansion of renewable energy capacity on a global scale. Their commitment to offshore underscored the increasing importance of this technology in the transition toward a cleaner and more sustainable energy source use. A trend is emerging as renewable-based power stands out today as the most cost-effective power option in the majority of regions around the world. This significant achievement underscored the economic viability and competitiveness of renewable energy sources, including offshore, making them a compelling choice for power generation. The ongoing reduction in cost is a significant milestone in the global energy transition. This decline represents a crucial phase in the transition to make clean energy accessible and affordable for all. The levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, associated with offshore has experienced a substantial decline, dropping from by approximately 48%. It's important to note that this cost reduction has placed today an increased pressure on the profit margin of industry players. This has led to calls within the sector for measures such as implementing price flooring options to safeguard profitability and ensure the sustainable growth of the offshore wind sector. This development highlights the delicate balance between cost competitiveness and industry sustainability within the offshore wind energy landscape. The integration of substantial share of renewable sources is significant and a commendable challenge, offering tangible benefit to the sector. However, this endeavor is not without challenges. One obstacle arises from location and site-specific constraints, which require infrastructure planning to ensure effective integration of renewable energy. The integration of renewable is crucial for several reasons. It will enhance the resilience of our system, making them more robust and adaptable, and will promote the use of local energy sources. Let's now delve into the specific. It is crucial to understand the multifaceted regulatory framework governing offshore wind energy projects. This framework encompasses a range of sources starting from international treaties and agreements that set the broader context for offshore development. At national level, policy and planning frameworks play a pivotal role in shaping the direction of offshore wind projects. At the local level, a series of policy and regulation come into play, particularly in the interface between wind energy project and the environment. This local policy encompasses diverse aspects, including biodiversity regulation, spatial planning regulation, noise regulation, nuisance regulation, safety, and others. These regulations aim to strike a balance between harnessing the potential of wind energy and addressing environmental and societal concerns. Adherence to environmental regulation is of paramount importance in that perspective, and several key measures are essential for the sector to ensure compliance. Spatial planning stands as the initial and strategic measure for wind and offshore wind energy projects. It involves the organization of sea space to ensure the long-term sustainability of activities, typically initiated at the project outset, Spatial planning utilizes zoning and policy-based approach to effectively allocate suitable area for offshore wind projects. Another critical measure is the assessment of environmental and social impact. This includes the full life cycle of the project and covers a wide range of factors, including landscape, seascape, visual impact, noise, biodiversity, shadow flickers, and water quality. Addressing this issue and developing mitigation strategy is essential, enabling the integration into site screening and feasibility studies through a thorough project impact. Crucially as well, effective stakeholder engagement is vital through the entire development process. This engagement facilitates the identification and resolution of concern and foster a smoother public acceptance process. Understanding the government's model behind this is crucial as well to put measuring policy into practice effectively. First, we see the centralized model where the government assumes the primary role of executing all aspects of wind energy development. This includes environmental and social impact assessments such as feasibility and others. Secondly, we see the decentralized model, which represents a different approach, offering more flexibility both for the private sector or the developer and the government, but place the responsibility for site selection and obtaining permits squarely on the developer. Lastly, there is a hybrid model, which strikes a balance between centralized and decentralized approach. In this model, typically the government takes the responsibility of early project development phase, such as the ESIA and initial planning, while the developer assumes control over project planning stage and technical aspect later on. It combines the government oversight with the developer expertise to facilitate the execution of project. In the recent IRENA GWEC brief on offshore wind permitting, we offer key insight into permitting process. The report identified common challenges, the lack of centralized authorities involved in permitting, highlighting the need for coordinated efforts. Additionally, we identified the lack of holistic planning in addressing complex stakeholder interaction. One of our recommendations discussed with member countries is the establishment of dedicated centralized authority and single point of contact to lead permitting efforts. Mandating maximum lead time for permittings is also another recommended measure. I wanted to highlight collaborative effort at the international level, which include the IRENA collaborative framework for offshore energy and offshore renewable, which include over 40 countries. This engagement extends and associate countries and industry associations, underscoring the collaborative nature of efforts in advancing offshore wind technology and ocean energy technologies. Recent achievement includes recommendation at the G20 level. And as well, we had the last meeting this month to provide inputs to the important COP28 next month in Dubai. Another important international and multi-stakeholder collaboration is the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which has emerged last year as a significant initiative founded by IRENA, Denmark, GWEC, with a mission to drive global offshore wind expansion through political mobilization and the establishment of a global community of practice. The primary aim of GOA is to make a substantial contribution in achieving a global offshore wind energy capacity of at least 380 gigawatts by 2030, reflecting a commitment to rapid and ambitious growth in the sector. We operate into key work streams that are pivotal in advancing offshore wind development and are inviting governments, the private sector, and organizations to join us in this initiative. I will now provide you the final recommendation from my presentation. We've seen that offshore wind is poised to assume a pivotal role in the pursuit of 1.5 degrees due to these declining costs and the expectation to an increased global installation. We believe that the development and permitting of offshore wind hinge on well-crafted policies and measures. So various models should be employed between highlighting the distinct role and responsibility between the government and the private sector to ensure a streamlined process. Permitting is a crucial milestone which should include the consideration of environmental and social aspects in the different phases. Last but not least, as I mentioned, engagement with international organizations, countries, and the private sector emerge as a crucial component of advancing offshore wind energy. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll give the floor back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that insightful talk. Just to throw in one question to you, Simon, as offshore wind and renewable energy demand surge, what are some of the ways that the oil and gas will change to maintain their competitiveness?
Thank you so much, Celela, for this question. So first of all, offshore wind can benefit from the expertise of the offshore industry. Obviously, we need vessels, we need skilled labor force to develop and provide, let's say, expertise into those projects. We see a lot of potential in cooperation into reskilling. At COP28, we are poised to announce an initiative that will help to reskill workforce that are work in the traditional or conventional offshore industry. And here as well, we see bridges between the expertise and also the progress that has offshore industry has developed, and the emergence of a new form of energy generation through offshore windmills. So here as well, we see that there is bridges between the conventional sector with a lot of employment, with a lot of expertise that can be translated into a new sector and will benefit the community and also strengthen the consideration related to safeguarding social aspects in many countries.
Thank you very much for that. Actually, makes a lot of sense in looking at it in that line. So I wish to invite our second speaker, Manon Smith. Manon Smith is a senior consultant, carbon limits. She has developed her expertise on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector through multiple qualitative and quantitative projects, including projects dealing with methane emissions and reporting from upstream and liquefied natural gas inventories, country assessments for the decarbonization of the oil and gas sector, and aspects of reconciliation. She has assisted in the development and implementation of the oil and gas monitoring technical guide. She also has experience working in Central Asia and North America. Feel welcome, Manon, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Celela. So now we are going to move on to a slightly different topic that doesn't necessarily cover directly renewable energy in sort of the ocean environment, but rather another aspect of decarbonization that can be carried through the sort of marine economy. And so this is to talk about methane emissions and how to deal with them in the offshore oil and gas sector. So first, a quick word about what we do in Carbon Limits. It's a relatively small company, so I believe not everyone has heard about it. We work on different aspects of decarbonization in the industry in general, more specifically in the energy industry. And so we work a lot on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector with a lot of different actors, sort of touching upon different topics as well related to that sector. So when we do country engagement, which we do actually quite a lot of, we always use these 5 main building blocks. So it's for countries, no matter where they are on their methane journeys, no matter what they already have in place or not. This is typically the way that we approach working with countries. So the first one is capacity building. So it's making sure that the people who are making the decisions and those who need it have all the resources available to them and all the technical knowledge, all the policy knowledge, for example, to be able to work on methane. Then we take a look at measurements. which is typically going out there to have a better idea of what it's like. In some cases, it's already been done, in which case we can use those results. We then have an inventory, so that's sort of using the results of the measurement, looking to see what emission sources are out there, how much they're emitting, which allows us to prioritize action. There's also an aspect, this is more directly related typically to regulators, it's policies and international cooperation, because this is also an important aspect of actually getting companies and operators to engage in a country. And then the final point is sort of building on all of that. It's to look at mitigation strategies, what can be done where and what should be done first to actually reduce those emissions. So the idea for this presentation is that I'll give you sort of a general view on each of these different aspects, and then we can see what differences are between onshore and offshore whenever there are some. So first, a quick word on methane, just a quick reminder, I think, for most of you. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It means that 1 ton of methane emitted actually corresponds to 86 tons of CO2 emitted if we look in terms of global warming potential on a short-term horizon. So this means that currently about, we say, a third of the warming that we are experiencing today comes from methane emissions because it has a sort of shorter-term effect on global warming. And so reducing methane emissions is sort of considered the fastest way to put the brakes on climate change and global warming today, because it allows to target that sort of short-term impact and warming that we are experiencing now, to give us a bit more time to work on CO2, which can be a bit more challenging. So if we look at methane offshore, we see that the offshore sector is responsible for 25% of the oil and gas production in the world. And that's looking just at production. But methane emissions come from the entire oil and gas sector, from production all the way to distribution. And so when we look at that, we see that sort of 15% of the methane emissions in the oil and gas sector actually come from this offshore production. It's mostly offshore production that happens, and then a bit of LNG shipping and a few floating facilities, but it's mostly linked to production. And of these 15%, there's actually 16% of the total abatement potential, so the emissions that can be reduced, that are currently in the offshore sector. So it's definitely a sector that can contribute to reducing methane emissions globally. Now, the first point in our building blocks was capacity building. So how to bring the required resources to all the stakeholders to make sure that they have everything they need to be able to make informed decisions. So for this, it's the same onshore and offshore. It's the same people. This is quite a general aspect of it. So what's important with capacity building is that we sort of need different levels of understanding for a broad range of stakeholders. Methane emissions mitigation is not only for operators, but it also involves regulators, it involves technology providers, it involves NGOs locally, it involves research and academics. So there is really a broad range of people that needs to, for their domain, get a better understanding of methane emissions. And this goes through having sort of a lot of people that have some understanding or a good awareness of what the methane emission challenge is, what does it represent, why is it important, and then sort of in this funnel approach, having less people, but that have a much more in-depth understanding of the issue to be able to actually work on it. If I take my example, I work on it every single day. I don't think we need as many of me in each company. That might be a bit overkill. So moving on to the second building block, which was detection and measurements. So there are a number of technologies that are available worldwide for methane emissions detection and quantification. They have different types of sensors, different types of carriers to be able to either detect and to quantify emissions. Now, onshore, most technologies are applicable. There are some variations depending on the conditions, but you can sort of deploy most technologies. When we look at offshore, there are a few specificities. So some technologies are not as easy or possible even to deploy when we consider sort of an offshore environment, which can make things more complicated. So for example, a big one that is used quite a lot is satellite detection. This one, there are some models that are under development to work offshore and to capture emissions that happen over water. But unfortunately, those models are not fully ready yet. And so this is an example of the limitations that can happen. Here I added the resources if you're interested to check out later. It's IOGP, OGCI, and IPCA that recently published a study on sort of recommended practices for methane emissions and detection technologies. And so in this case, they alongside it have an emissions technology filtering tool. And there is a filter that says, is this technology sort of applicable offshore? Is it technically feasible to deploy this on a platform? And so this allows operators to filter through it and to see what they actually could deploy on an offshore asset. The next building block here is to develop an inventory. So that can be based either on the measurements that we just talked about, or in some cases, it's done through emission factors and sort of equipment count to get a first idea. Essentially, onshore and offshore inventory is pretty much the same. It's going out, identifying each component, each equipment, understanding how much they emit, and then putting all that into sort of either a big Excel sheet or a nice software that can help you out with that to understand where your emissions are and how much they emit. For offshore, there are a few points that sort of need to be taken into account. So the first one is that it is a different environment. So for some of the typical sort of emission factors or other calculation factors that are used to determine emissions, you need to take into account that specific environment and the fact that some offshore values might not fully apply to offshore operations because of the difference in conditions. We could think for flare, for example, it might be exposed to more wind. For others, there are sort of different rules on health and safety of the personnel, and so there could be some differences there. The other point, if we look at sort of the other ocean-related activity of the oil and gas sector, it's mostly linked to LNG shipping. LNG shipping is currently sort of one of the less well-studied segments of the oil and gas sector in terms of methane emissions. There are a number of studies that have recently been published and that are being carried out now, but it does make it a bit more challenging for vessel operators to be able to use sort of generic emission factors because these are not necessarily available and there's still a big unknown around this. A next sort of big building block is for policies and international cooperation. When we look at policies, it's mostly applicable in both cases, both onshore and offshore. Some countries choose to deal with it together. Others, like Norway, tend to split it. So, for example, there are different reporting requirements between onshore and offshore assets at the moment that are just considered differently for historical reasons. But typically, if we think of the essence of the policies, they are quite similar. The one that is more challenging, again, is LNG shipping. As we know, the maritime sector is slightly different, especially when it's international waters. So there are some rules that apply globally, but there are also some policies that do not apply to the maritime sector. But there are now an increasing number of initiatives that look at the entire oil and gas value chain, LNG shipping included. Just a few points of attention for the offshore sector. So implementing policy in the offshore sector can in some cases be a bit more challenging for regulators to implement because of accessibility. It's not that easy to get a verifier out and get all the offshore accreditations to go and take a look to make sure that emissions are being reported as they should and to go around and make sure that everything was included. But on the other hand, offshore typically has a more intense focus on safety due to just to the nature of operations. And so it follows stricter safety rules, which can also make it sort of easier to verify and also to identify any potential issues. Because those rules are already in place for safety, there's a number of things that already need to be done or reported, and so that can sort of build on that for methane emissions regulation. And now there's a number of new initiatives that are actually covering quite well LNG shipping and the LNG sector in general, really allowing to focus on that and to see where the gaps are to improve knowledge there as well. So here we have an example. There is now for the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is a reporting initiative for companies that is led by UNEP. There is a specific technical guidance document for LNG shipping. All right, and for the last building block, which is where we want to get to, which is actual mitigation strategies, it works more or less the same as with onshore. So again, it's the idea of looking through the inventory, seeing what is possible, how much would it cost, and then being able to prioritize mitigation measures based on that. And that works for the same onshore and offshore. Offshore, there's usually a bit more challenges on which mitigation option can be implemented, and this is typically due to the weight limits, and sort of everything has been designed and optimized in the way that it is, and so a retrofit can be challenging to carry out in the offshore environment. But of course, when we think about health and safety, any sort of reduction in methane emissions is really important for the safety of the personnel working on the platforms. And then also the final point is that typically offshore installations are much more centralized, so it can be in a way easier to know that all the emissions are located within this very specific area, and if I change something there, I'm impacting the emissions of the entire equipment that is there, instead of having it spread out over hundreds of wells in a very large field. So all this to show that offshore activities can definitely play a big role in methane emission reductions. It's true there are some challenges, but there are also some aspects that can make it easier to address and to be able to focus on methane emission reduction in the sector with some interesting co-benefits.
Thank you, Manon. I want to take it that this was the last slide.
Yes, sorry, yes, this was my last slide.
Oh, thank you very much for that presentation. I think I just acknowledge that probably this is one area that a number of African developing countries have not given due attention, and I think it would be interesting to engage further on this as they still steer to develop the sector. But just one question, Manon. What are the other sources of emissions in offshore oil and gas, and how can they be reduced?
Yes, thanks a lot, Soledad, for your question. So methane is definitely one of the big emission sources in the oil and gas sector, and it's the easiest one to reduce, but there's also, of course, linked to the operations CO2 emissions, so anything to do with the burning of the gas for power and heat, but also acid gas removal, which is the removal of CO2 from the gas, which lead to CO2 emissions. Those are typically more expensive to reduce, so that's why they're taken sort of after methane emissions reduction action, because it does cost a bit more, but there are solutions that exist to actually get to near zero emissions oil and gas production and oil and gas systems, and that can be for CO2, it can be through the electrification of installations, and it does work offshore. There are a few examples in Norway of sort of electrified offshore oil and gas production platform. And also there's carbon capture and storage that can help reduce those emissions by capturing either the acid gas that is coming from the well or from combustion for power and heat purposes, and then put it back into the formations, which typically are located close to oil and gas fields because it's similar formations that can be used. So there's an example of this in Australia, for example, with the Oregon project, where they capture the gas and re-inject it into a formation close to where they're producing.
Thank you. I wish to invite our speaker for the day, that panelist, Ovin Arnes, who is a principal environmental scientist with DNV and lives in Bergen, Norway. Ovin is an environmentalist and a scientist and has 25 years devoted, and for her 25 years has devoted his work to environmental science and sustainability. He's a specialist in geographic information systems and has a background in forestry and environmental engineering. For the past 10 years, the focus of his work has been on climate action, oceanography, and sustainable ocean planning. Thank you, Ovin. Welcome.
Thank you, Selena. I will present together with my colleague Sigurd Pettersen on the race for ocean space. And I'd like to start here with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. They inspire coexistence, and good coexistence permits all the goals. Coexistence, if designed well, can work across all these goals to be more efficient. The goals are all interconnected, cross-cutting, and designed to inspire action, give direction, purpose, and hope. And while they represent a world of opportunity, they are also a daunting challenge. A deep concern for the energy transition is that it must be a just and equitable transition, providing reliable and affordable energy for all, where no one is left behind. Rising inequality in the world threatens to deepen the divide, and so access to renewables must benefit developing countries and least developed countries as well. I wanted to touch on the connectivity of the ocean and climate, this sublime relationship, and that the ocean plays a fundamental role for the environment of our planet. It plays a fundamental role in the Earth climate system. It cleans the air we breathe, and it regulates weather and climate. The ocean traps over 90% of the excess heat generated through anthropogenic emissions, and it has taken up 20 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions since the 1980s. And these observed changes, they vary from equatorial to and mid-latitudes to polar waters, and between the northern and southern hemisphere. By polar amplification, the Arctic is warming now 3 times as fast as the global mean. And while these changes are happening, we are having ocean warming, deoxygenation, acidification, and changes in ocean circulation. The blue economy must adapt to these changes also. And now let's turn closer to home, for me at least. Here we take a country level perspective on likely developments in the next decades. We see the Norwegian management plan areas and current fishing activity shown in light blue here. We're also showing ecologically or biologically significant areas in shaded blue and some other restricted fishing zones. And these small rectangles here are proposed areas for offshore wind development in Norwegian seas. And clearly there are some challenges in how to best plan for co-use and co-development in the ocean space. They will require lots of space, and space is indeed limited. Changes are driven by fish living areas, sensitive areas, distribution and abundance of key species, their preferred habitats, the build out of offshore wind to meet ambition of 30 gigawatts in Norway by 2040. And climate change is driving challenges, and marine protection. With the COP15 landmark biodiversity agreement was signed with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, with ambition or the target, the goal of protecting 30% of degraded ecosystems under protection by 2030. And last week, the EU followed up with an agreement on the nature restoration law, calling for national restoration plans, binding targets to restore 20% of European seas and 30% of degraded habitats by 2030. And so there are several initiatives coming on nature protection and the restoration of nature. Not least, the Nature Positive initiative is incredibly valuable. Oh, zooming in a little bit to the west coast of Norway, just to give a little example of some of the work we're working on in DNV. Here you can see a rectangle of a proposed wind farm site and the interactions here with fisheries. So coexistence between offshore wind and fisheries is a key challenge, I'd say, in Norwegian areas. Our seas are fished, and we have big plans for offshore wind development. Here you can see it's actually shrimp trawling going on in this area, and they don't want to, or the wind farm and shrimp trawling doesn't go very well together. To the left here, we have a cod spawning area and a sensitive area inside the wind farm due to seabirds nesting. We have some marine protected areas. And all of these considerations have to be seen together to make the best decisions. So we're looking at what are the long-term implications for the fishing industry, and how can synergies and conflicts be resolved, and what are effective strategies to attain nature positive and ensure the restoration of nature from 2030. And with that, I will hand it over to my good colleague Sigurd Pettersen, who will tell you about our approach to system dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovin. Before Sigurd takes over, let me just do a quick introduction for the participants. Sigurd Pettersen is a senior researcher in the Ocean Space program of DNV's Group Research and Development Unit. He holds a PhD and MSc in marine technology from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, with a focus within ship design and logistics. His work focuses on building synergies and interlinkages between different sectors in the ocean space. With that, Sigurd, kindly continue.
Thank you, Selena. Let's zoom out a little bit again to DNV's approach now to the blue economy and taking a systems view on the blue economy. So DNV is a company that provides assurance services and risk management for industries across essentially all ocean value chains, including maritime, offshore wind, other offshore renewables that are coming, oil and gas, and aquaculture. So we have quite a broad footprint. And building on our business position across the ocean economy, we have taken a holistic systems approach to providing insight. So this picture here essentially shows our system dynamics modeling model. which takes a cross-sectoral view and the long-term view, forecasting the global blue economy to 2050. Focusing essentially on the drivers of the key sectors in the blue economy and the key feedbacks all the way from external drivers, really, like population growth, improvements of living standards, and how that trickles into demand for goods and services, and then investments in various sectors in the ocean. We pay particular attention to cross-sectoral challenges and interlinkages, such as access to and competition for marine space, and through that also opportunities for coexistence and co-use of area. Investment and costs of operating in the ocean economy, supply chain interlinkages, and of course, as Øyvind has talked a little bit about, dependencies on ecosystem services in the ocean and the ocean environment. Click next, Øyvind. Yeah. So this slide here essentially shows the overall mix of investments in the global ocean economy to 2050, as forecast by us. So we see that the overall level of investments in the blue economy across sectors remain fairly constant to 2050. But for sectors, for non-energy sectors, make up only 25% of the overall investments being made. And that will continue. So 75% of the blue economy investments we foresee will continue to be energy related. But within that space, of course, there is a huge shift already happening. So you see the current leader, offshore oil and gas, which is currently contributing something like 75%, actually will reduce down to 25% of the investments in the ocean economy. Whereas renewable energy, led by ocean wind, will rise to contribute 50%. So this is a huge change. One more click, Øyvind. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a huge change, and of course one that comes with a lot of consequences when we look at the area footprint. The next slide. So while the investments stay more or less on a constant level, what does not is actually the impact the blue economy will have on mankind's physical footprint in the ocean. So if you look at the area that will be needed to facilitate the build out of in our forecast 1.6 terawatts of offshore wind, or in the arena view 2.5, I heard. We actually need quite a lot of area. So what we in DNV have been doing over the last few years is actually also to try and estimate what is the impact now of this build out on area. And we see a fivefold increase in the amount of space that is needed to accommodate all the physical infrastructure needed. So that in total, offshore wind will actually lay claim to approximately 80% of the area offshore that will be reserved for physical installations at sea. That is before we consider mobile activities like fishing and shipping, but still it's quite a lot. Then the next slide. So taking a step down into the world's regions, of course, there is a huge difference there in how this need for space in the ocean plays out geographically, both as a function of socioeconomic development, but also as a function of the physical characteristics of the world's sea areas. Where our system dynamics model actually has a very global focus. We have conducted in-depth analysis now, first of Europe and North America, where we forecast spatial competition to 2050. So here you actually see our spatial competition index mapped out, taking the sum of all claims to space divided by the amount of space available. So red there essentially means that there is a fairly high degree of spatial competition, and a large amount of the available space at the given depth or within a given distance to shore has been made use of. This index, of course, also serves as a risk metric in in areas where there is a lot of activity, stakeholder conflicts may become more likely, and hence the sort of advantage or benefit of seeking multi-use solutions that aim to create synergies between sectors are very important to investigate. And this assessment really also shows the need for spatial planning, marine spatial planning, to address potentially conflicting objectives like renewable energy production, seafood production, and nature protection that are reflected in the SDGs, and to manage the trade-offs that emerge over time. And you can take the final slide, David. Yeah, just yeah. So I want to close with an overview of some of the key work that DNV is doing in this space. So first, we are publishing yearly energy transition outlook reports. So the 2023 edition was published now in October. And that is DNV's forecast of the ongoing global transformation of the energy system. This is also followed by a number of reports on pathways to net zero and a particular deep dive in maritime. Then second, click one more time. Our work is the Ocean's Future to 2050, which cover the most likely view of the ocean economy, emphasizing the impacts of large-scale system transformations like the energy transition, how those play out in the ocean. Third, our work on spatial competition covers these in-depth assessments of the emerging challenges, but also opportunities relating to coexistence. And finally, we are currently exploring how the tools and methods that we have developed for the purpose of forecasting, how those can actually be used to facilitate broader stakeholder engagement in marine spatial planning processes, as well as in consenting processes, specifically for offshore wind and offshore aquaculture. So with that, I want to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Sigurd and Alvin. I have a question for you, but I would want to take it during the Q&A session that we are about to start. But before I do that, we had a great speaker. The opening remarks were given by Jessica Smith. Maybe just to start us off, as we initiate this particular one, I just want to ask her one question. That we know that in your remarks there was consideration for renewable energy. So probably I just want us to understand how sustainable blue economy finance space can also recognize the role of offshore oil and gas in this particular current situation that we are in. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. So I showed the guidance that we have for broadly sectors that are in the sustainable blue economy. So all of those include the opportunities I called seek out, where financial institutions would be looking to finance proactively when they're looking to finance, for example, under a sustainable finance target. Now, there are other sectors in the ocean, and I mentioned, there are blue economy sectors that are not sustainable blue economy sectors. So we have classed offshore oil and gas because of the greenhouse gas emissions as a harmful marine extractive sector. So the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative looks at 3 different sectors where financial institutions may want to provide finance, but are not considered sustainable sectors. So these include offshore oil and gas and deep sea mining, as well as dredging and marine aggregate extraction. Now, the final one, dredging, is controversial, I would say, because sometimes dredging is necessary, for example, for renewable energy offshore. But each of these sectors has another set of guidance, which gives very detailed information on risk and impact for financial institutions, and particularly in this case, investors who are looking to operate to support clients and businesses in those sectors. So I do encourage everyone to, if that is a sector that you operate in, to have a look to understand what financial institutions would be looking for. And if you are a financial institution, these guidance products provide a lot of tips for engagement with your clients on how they could, for example, better design activities to minimize harm.
Very much for that response. I think it's quite enlightening. So over to you, Simon. I just want to also throw one question again to you, coming from the participants. The question is, that are wind energy projects feasible for all coastal areas? For instance, coast of Western Africa, and what are the social and environmental implications?
Thank you so much, Selena. And yes, I'm very happy for this question. I think indeed the offshore wind projects are feasible and valuable for coastal area with a large urban and dense population, because they provide cost-effective power to those areas, and including the one from Western Africa. And this project can scale up quickly from hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts. And thanks to the high energy output, so the energy density and the advancement of the turbine, they are a very efficient way as well to use the sea. So in summary, they are feasible, they are beneficial, and the success and implementation, they are, as I mentioned earlier, highly dependent on efficient permitting and this is supportive policy framework to address environmental and social concern effectively for those regions.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. I would want to also get to Manon. Which countries have the largest methane emissions from offshore upstream oil and gas? And what are the major roadblocks to mitigating them?
This is an excellent question. I had a bit of a dig through the data. So I used IEA methane tracker. We know that there are some uncertainties around methane emission quantification. So this might not be 100% the reflection of reality, but I think it does give us a good idea. So in the top 5 countries, I have in first place Iran, and then Brazil, as well as Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Mexico, all countries which have sort of large offshore operations, which sort of explains that more operations will likely lead to more methane emissions in general. But it's also countries where, for those that I know in this list, have limited policy, either in directly including methane emission reduction laws, or that have trouble enforcing those policies, notably offshore, where we know implementation is more challenging. One big challenge with sort of methane emissions offshore is that there's a need for a market for gas to be able to do something with those emissions that isn't just flaring, which we also know leads to methane emissions, even though it being sort of not as bad as just venting them. So it's probably linked a lot to that. And when we think of the countries in there, Iran being the top one and being a sanctioned country does make it more difficult to have investments to set up those networks to actually collect the gas offshore, for example. In the other ones, it can be the conditions. For example, when we think of Nigeria, on
I think we lost Manon. She's disconnected. Or is it me?
Manon, we can't hear you, sorry. Manon, looks like we lost you.
it's telling me I'm still here. Ah, there we go. Sorry, I don't know. what it wanted.
You were speaking on Nigeria when we lost you.
Thanks a lot. So in Nigeria, there isn't necessarily a full sort of developed onshore distribution system in place to actually sort of capture the gas, but then there can also be some interesting projects where the gas is captured offshore. There's investments that are done on pipelines to bring them onshore for gas power plant electricity production unit, for example.
Thank you, Manon. And over to DNV team. Since you are two, I would want to throw two questions to both of you from the participants. What are the best practices for stakeholder engagement in blue economy planning and decision making? Number two, how can we promote innovation and technological advancement in the blue economy?
Okay, shall I have a go with the first, Sigurd? And
Go first.
Some of the best practices for stakeholder engagement, I think early engagement with stakeholders is a key ingredient, and this inclusive and constructive dialogue with all stakeholders, and ensuring that all stakeholder groups are represented, and also the ability to harness local knowledge both on environmental concerns and yeah, challenges, local challenges, local knowledge for a site-specific development or something. And the fourth point is to create good arenas to meet and have dialogue with stakeholders. It could be schools or churches or soccer fields, just sharing information on development.
Yeah, I want to also highlight the need for sort of common understanding of what is the best available knowledge. In our experience, when we've been discussing, for instance, offshore wind build out with developers and with fishermen, it's often emphasis on slightly different points regarding, for instance, area efficiency of farms. And so to have stakeholders sit down and actually exploring those data that are out there, do that in sort of a community or practice approach, or an arena where they actually sit down together and look at data visualized in a good manner. I think that is extremely valuable. To just agree on the basic assumptions, what are actually the facts on the ground, because that is just so important. And then on to the second question, could you repeat that? Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, how can we promote innovation and technological advancement in the blue economy?
Yeah, go first, Sigurd.
Yeah, so in our work, we've been looking at a little bit into sort of the impacts of clear regulatory frameworks. Often those are not in place, even in countries like Norway. We've had a lot of difficulties when it comes to, for instance, offshore fish farming, which has been the talk of the town for years, but it's really slow, and the signals from government agencies aren't necessarily super clear. So I think to have that predictability on the sort of governance side is extremely important. Otherwise, people won't be very willing to invest. Second to that, I think when it comes to scaling offshore renewables, you'll see the impacts now of cost increases, inflationary pressure, rising steel prices, and so on. So also to have government step in for a period of time to take some of that burden through contracts of difference or other means, I think is is also a necessary stepping stone in a lot of cases. So finance.
Yeah, I can just add that sharing of knowledge again within the industry, I think is really important. Sharing of data, exchanges of best practices between different wind developers and also government. And then also the role of finance and regulation in stimulating for innovation. I think that's creating incentivize innovation. That's a key point.
Thank you very much. Just a follow-up question, though I think I've had some conversation that probably attempts to address my follow-up question, is that how is Norway resolving these social and environmental issues that you've raised?
Yes. There are a number of social and environmental issues, and all of them are not solved. On the environmental side, there are challenges and there are knowledge gaps, and there's a lot of research going on understanding the effects of offshore wind, for instance. But that said, regulations are underway. Norway is planning for a new Ocean Environment Act, probably coming next year, which will set the boundaries for some of these things. And we have the Norwegian management plans as a framework for resolving environmental and social concerns today. I know, Sigurd, something to add?
Yeah, I maybe want to add the approach of the European Union mandating marine spatial planning, which is not implemented to the same degree in Norway. I think it's a topic or an area where Norway maybe has the potential to learn from what is happening in the EU.
Thank you. Just to have another question for Manon. I'll be getting back to Simon shortly. Manon, what are the potential economic impacts of methane emissions from the offshore oil and gas sector?
That's a really good question. So there's sort of multiple impacts when we think of the economics of it. The first one that we think of is safety. Methane is an explosive gas, so definitely sort of keeping everyone safe, keeping the installations intact is sort of an essential point of not dealing with methane emissions. And then there's the much more difficult to quantify impact of methane emissions linking to climate change on any kind of economic activity as we are seeing today. If we think about methane emission reduction, what's interesting with methane and why also there's so much focus on it in the oil and gas sector is that methane is a product. So reducing methane emissions can actually lead to increased economic return for producers if they manage to have more methane in the pipes, more gas in the pipes. It means that they can increase their sale, and that allows to have a return on investment on sort of methane emissions mitigation action, which is not necessarily the case with other sectors or with other types of pollutants. So this is why also this is a good case, that it's both good for the environment and economically interesting for oil and gas producers.
So it can give us a win-win if well utilized. So back to you, Simon. What are the implications of offshore wind energy infrastructure on navigation?
Okay, that's an interesting one. I think I've mentioned the aspect of marine spatial planning. I think that's important, and obviously the infrastructure can have an implication and needs to be planned ahead, and will likely lead to change in, for example, shipping routes, and may require new navigation system to ensure safe passage around wind farm. I think that's totally something that the industry can do. It has been done for ages, so this is not a new, let's say, measure for offshore wind. And they obviously need to consider the impact on marine traffic during both the construction phase, which is concentrated in a few months, but will require travel between the land and the sea for a specific, let's say, equipments. And obviously the operation phase will span between 25 and 40 years, 50 years even for recent technology. Effective planning in that space and coordination with maritime authorities and the stakeholders of the sea are essential to mitigate those implications, ensure that offshore wind coexists safely with the marine navigation.
Thank you. Another quick one for the DNV team, Sigurd and Oivind. What are the best practices for stakeholder engagement in blue economy planning? So, did you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I wonder if we got that one before, or is it?
I think so.
But yes, I'd say early engagement and inclusion and dialogue, stakeholder management, knowledge sharing.
We can maybe add some follow up to some of the questions for some. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, the navigational risk and the feasibility of offshore wind in different areas is that you, of course, will very quickly be put into seawater depths where we actually would have to go for floating solutions, and those are not yet really proven operationally. So I would say that is it's probably coming, but it's a question mark on the cost side, definitely. I think not knowing too much about the depths of West Africa, I think that is absolutely a constraint that needs to be understood.
Yes, and the grid connectivity in Africa, yeah, the societal sides of it also, workforce availability, and yeah.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll give you two more questions, one for Simon and one for Manon, so that we can have our takeaways as we conclude. So to Simon, there's a question from a participant that acknowledges the good presentation you made in the energy mix and climate sector. And the question is, are there any risks involved in offshore wind sector, and how can they be mitigated?
Thank you, Selena. I think that's a fundamental, let's say, approach for those projects to integrate from the start risk mitigation and the risk, let's say, identification, assessment, and mitigation. Obviously, there is many categories of risk: technical risk, financial risk, site-specific risk. In this webinar, we're focusing more on the environmental and social aspect, which I can delve in. I could go all in on risk. This is one of my, let's say, sweet spot there. But risk in the environmental and social aspects are located in lengthy and complex permitting processes across the geographies, opposition from specific groups, and challenges, as mentioned before, in grid connectivity. To mitigate this risk, obviously, streamline permitting process through centralized authority, effective maritime spatial planning, and investing from the public side and the private side in critical grid infrastructure are essential. Our GWEC Arena brief mentioned the recommendation from countries to establish a one-stop shop model for permitting and considering joint transmission line, which can enhance efficiently and reduce project development time. And this is at stake because many projects take an excruciating amount of time to be developed, and permitting and such can further delay. And we have, as I mentioned, no time to match 2030 targets. We need those projects online as soon as possible, and those mitigation measures should be implemented from the start and supported by all stakeholders in, let's say, the project environment.
Thank you, Simon. Manon, in the interest of time, just one more question for you. And finally, I'll go back to Jessica as we wind up. So Manon, what are the challenges of measuring the carbon intensity of LNG? Not just shipping, but all the way from wellhead to a liquefaction facility to a vessel and regasification terminal. That is from one of the participants.
Yes, thanks a lot. Just to do it very briefly, so it is onshore quite easy and with fixed installations to measure methane emissions. So if we want to follow sort of a molecule of gas throughout its entire production cycle and then down to distribution, it's quite easy. The challenge is mostly to do with LNG shipping, just because it is a mobile emission source, which makes it a lot more challenging to track and also to know over time. So when it's in port, for example, it's possible. When it's out at sea that the engines are running on different loads, it can be a lot more challenging to know exactly what those emissions are.
Thank you very much. So I want us to just, from all the speakers, just 30 seconds, 1 minute as we wrap up. But I would ask Jessica this as she closes, that are there special funding grants arrangements or support that developing countries can access under the blue economy? Thank you.
Great question. So absolutely, there are certainly funding resources for developing countries in marine and coastal areas. Actually, we have developed a database with the Biofin initiative of UNDP called FIRE. So it's fire.biofin.org, and it actually lists 166 funding or finance opportunities that are linked to marine and coastal ecosystems. So these include funding from the Global Environment Facility, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, the Nature Conservancy, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Alliance. And I wanted to also mention that we are initiating a series of webinars for all countries who are updating their national biodiversity strategy and action plans in the coming year. So we have partnered with Biofin in the context of the GEF7 early action support to help countries understand what are private finance opportunities that could help for marine and coastal areas. So not only the public finance, but also where there are private financing opportunities in that space. So it should be announced shortly, and it will take place, the first one will take place in December. And we continue to collect questions from countries who are looking to use private finance in their NBSAP implementation and engage banks, insurers, and investors in the review of their NBSAPs to understand where there could be potential private financing opportunities. So very briefly, I see a lot of increasing alignment between the incentives that are out there to transition to sustainability and market activity, and also regulators moving along at the same place. So my takeaway is optimism, that I think we're all trying to move as quick as we can to meet the net zero and other commitments that are there for our collective interest for humanity. So thank you.
Jessica, Simon, 30 seconds, take away.
Ladies first.
Thanks, Simon. I can go ahead first. So what I'm taking away from the different presentations today is that there are definitely some solutions that do exist on how to have the ocean contribute to these sort of general emission reductions and through sort of renewable energies, but these solutions can also work together. When we think of existing oil and gas platform being able to use some of the wind power production that's happening next to it could, for the remaining life of the oil and gas platform, actually be sort of powered through that, for example. And so there are a lot of synergies as well within the ocean space that exist.
My takeaway
Thank you.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ben Maraz.
Yes, so thank you so much. My takeaway from the discussion is, I think, the imperative of international collaboration. The success of offshore wind energy pivotal for the energy transition, and the pledge for to triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency hinge on shared global commitment and cooperative efforts. The governments cannot do this alone. They need, let's say, the collaboration from the private sector, from the civil society. And this includes harmonizing policies, sharing technology innovation, and fostering global partnership like the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. By working together, we can overcome barriers, streamlining permitting processes, enable more financing for developing countries, and to achieve the ambitious 1.5 degree targets more effectively. The involvement of international organizations, national governments, the private sector, the civil society is essential, as it allows for the pooling of resources, expertise, and experience, leading to a more efficient and sustainable development of offshore wind projects worldwide.
Very much, Arvin.
Yes. I guess my takeaway is that, like the other speakers have said, collaboration and partnerships, cross-sector perspectives and learnings brought forward in policy making. I think that's important.
Thank you, Sigurd.
Yeah, from my side, I just want to finalize by saying that even though there is a huge ocean out there, most economic activity will be more or less centralized and driven by hubs. So it's essential that we find good synergies in those areas that will be fairly crowded. And I think we have touched on some of the processes and so on that need to be in place to realize that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, presenters, for the insights. Thank you also participants for the great questions that have also made us to some thought-provoking engagements here. I just want to appreciate that this actually was quite interesting. I think we take note of the need for policies, both internationally and nationally. The role of collaboration is powerful to influence change, and the fact that stakeholder engagement is critical. While we acknowledge, yes, according to what we've heard from Jessica, financing is available, but we cannot do financing. If we want to run sustainability in this blue economy, then we have to put everyone on board. We must engage everyone, and we must ensure that our governance is above board. Thank you. I hand over to Sadika. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, to all of our speakers, for contributing, for all of our audience, for so many questions. I'm sorry we couldn't go through all of them, but so engaging. Thank you also to Marisol Estrella, the program coordinator of the UNEP Norway partnership, as well as to Hadong Zhang, the intern on our team, who has helped us so much with everything behind the scene. I just wanted to go over some of the next steps. This is a recorded webinar, and a link will be uploaded on YouTube. You will get a follow-up email with a link to this webinar. I've also noticed that not everybody could access the presentations, so we will include a link to all of the presentations in this email. And of course, there will also be an evaluation survey included in the email. If you finish this evaluation survey, you will get your certificate of participation. Now, if you have attended our first webinar session in October, as well as this, I would encourage you to attend our third webinar session on 6 December 2023 on strategic environmental assessments and planning tools for sustainable ocean planning. For our participants who attend all 3 webinar sessions, in addition to getting the participation certificates, they will also get a certificate of successful completion of the annual global webinar series. That's about it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will also upload a link to our LinkedIn. You'll find that in the chat now. You can join us and connect with us on LinkedIn. And since you have attended today, you will also receive our newsletter, which you get in the first week of each month, and it goes through the recent developments within the energy sector. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and see you on 6 December 2023. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.